So My Hero Academia chapter 362 dropped and took the internet by storm, by it literally trending all over anime Twitter. It's possibly the biggest chapter that has dropped so far in the series, and if you couldn't tell by now, if you are an anime only viewer, then please click off of the video because everything is going to be spoiled right about now. So Horikoshi basically killed off Bakugo in chapter 362 of My Hero Academia, and the way the chapter was set up had to be one of the saddest moments and just chapters in general in the entire series, because as Bakugo was dying, he met the spirit of All Might, and we found out that his only regret was not having All Might sign his rare All Might playing card that he got as a kid. Then it all ends for Bakugo as his heart seemingly explodes and we see him lying on the ground dead. This chapter left tons of fans freaking out and just straight up ugly crying all over the internet because of it. And honestly, I believe Horikoshi made a very bold decision and actually killed Bakugo this chapter. This whole chapter was enough to make a grown man cry, but not today, because I full-heartedly, yeah, I know it was bad, believe that Bakugo is going to rise up to fight once more, and the way he's going to come back from death's door is due to his quirk explosion via his nitroglycerin-like sweat and his possible ties to the second user of One For All. Let me explain. So like I stated earlier, the chapter ends with us finding out that Bakugo's heart had completely stopped working, and we pretty much see a dead Bakugo lying on the floor. But what I find the most interesting about this is that it specifically pointed out that something happened to his heart. Hell, we even see the damn thing explode in the chapter, which is the reason why he is lying there dead. I mean, yeah, your heart stopping / exploding is going to do that to you, but the fact that it happened to someone like Bakugo, whose quirk, medically speaking, can actually revive him specifically from his heart failing on him. As we know, Bakugo's quirk explosion allows him to secrete a nitroglycerin-like sweat from the palms of his hands, and he is able to ignite it on command, creating explosions. In the chapter, we get an explanation from the narrator that Bakugo's new cluster super move had an unexpected side effect on him that not even Bakugo himself realized. When condensing his explosions into balls, it caused way too much strain on his palms, so he had accumulated so much sweat to the point that it ended up traveling throughout his entire body in search of different exit routes, since his palms were so strained, thus resulting in explosions being set off throughout the inside of his body. In other words, it seems that Bakugo's explosion is what actually ended up stopping his heart, which is why we see a panel of his heart pretty much blowing up. On top of that, Shig for one looks to have landed a fatal blow to Bakugo's chest, leaving a bloody wound on his chest. Things really aren't looking so good for Bakugo right now. But for the theory, the important thing to take note from all of this is that Bakugo's nitroglycerin-like sweat has traveled all throughout his body by this point. Now in real life, nitroglycerin is actually used to help those with certain heart conditions as well as heart failures, and even helped revive those whose hearts have completely stopped working. This would absolutely be an insane fake out, but it would make a ton of sense given Bakugo's quirk producing this nitroglycerin-like sweat and already having that nitroglycerin-like sweat being traveled throughout his whole body. Plus, we have seen in the past that characters have been shown to survive almost exactly what Bakugo has been through. Keywords here being almost exactly. Gran Torino being one of them, who took Shigaraki's arm through his body and still survived back in the Paranormal Liberation War arc. But the most interesting character to survive something fatal was Lady Nagant, who was completely blown up from the inside and still survived. What makes Nagant's case even more interesting is that her quirks didn't give her any sort of immunity that we know of from explosions, so her survival is actually really insane. Bakugo's quirk, on the other hand, or should I say his body, does physically give him immunity to a certain extent from his own explosions. I know this sounds crazy, but back in chapter 301, we found out that Toya was physically not built to endure fire, but rather to withstand freezing temperatures, which is why later on we see him burn to a crisp on Sekoto Peak due to his quirk, since his body wasn't built to give him the immunity needed to withstand his fire type quirk. So despite the heart being one of the most delicate organs in the entire body, theoretically speaking, the inside of Bakugo's body should have some sort of protection from his explosions, so his heart probably didn't full on explode as depicted in the panel and was actually shown for dramatic effect, given that we know that a person's body should be built from birth to eventually withstand their own quirk. With all that said, all that the heroes would need to do right now is to try and resuscitate Bakugo, to try and get his heart pumping once more, since the nitroglycerin-like sweat has already traveled through his body, which would make it easier to bring him back from the dead. Of course, we don't know if it would even be possible, since we saw what looks to be his heart exploding, and on top of that, I don't think Shig for one would even give our heroes the chance to try and bring him back to life, as his goal right now is to make sure Bakugo is dead before Deku arrives. Now, the only remaining question here is, how does this all tie into the second One For All user? And honestly, I'm not entirely sure, so everything I say from this point forward will be entirely based off of speculation and very little evidence. So in the chapter, there looks to be some hints that this will end up leading to a possible quirk awakening that will somehow tie into the second user of One For All, if Bakugo does indeed end up surviving. The first hint being that during Bakugo's cluster attack, Shig for one wonders why Bakugo, a person without One For All, is making him so anxious, where he then suddenly remembers the second user of One For All. And the second hint being that after Bakugo gets sent flying by Shig for one, a newscaster stated that the temperatures have suddenly risen up in certain regions, as well as there being weather disturbances in those regions. Now, in the fandom, there is a popular theory stating that Bakugo is actually the second user of One For All due to time travel, as well as them having a very similar appearance to one another. I mean, have you seen the Second's gauntlet? That is way too on the nose to be a coincidence. But for me, I don't think this is the case. One of My Hero Academia's major themes in the series is family and how these ties span generations. We've seen it from Redestro with the Meta Liberation Army, the Todorokis, and especially from One For All and All For One. I believe Bakugo is actually a descendant of the second user, which is why Shig for one suddenly was reminded of the second user when facing against Bakugo. Whatever ability the second has is what could potentially be awakening within Bakugo, and whatever that ability is could potentially already be taking effect right now within Bakugo due to the sudden rise in temperatures and weather disturbances. This also could be why the second user and Bakugo are always teased to have some sort of relation to one another, and why the second tells Deku to only use his quirk as a last resort. That's really all the speculation I have when it comes to how all of this could tie to the second user of One For All. As for the theory of Bakugo coming back to life, if Horikoshi ends up making it make sense, it could possibly be one of the most genius ways of bringing back a character back from the dead. We've seen time and time again from different shonen series and comics of characters dying and somehow coming back to life in very dumb ways that feel very plot armory, though very few in shonen and in comics in general have actually been done really well. So I wouldn't mind seeing it happen where it actually makes sense. Plus, if you've ever read a superhero comic, this sort of stuff happens all the time with characters dying and then coming back, so I guess I'm sort of used to it by now. Theory aside though, I do believe this could very well be the end for Bakugo in My Hero Academia. As much as I would hate for this to be the case, I'm perfectly fine with it. Bakugo is one of my favorite characters in the series, and even though it's going to hurt to see him go knowing he had so much potential to do more, the fact that he didn't give up till the very end shows that he truly was a hero through and through. And chapter 362 will go down as one of the greatest chapters in My Hero Academia.